Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, team. Welcome, Dafna. Delighted to have you. It is a homecoming for Dafna. We are delighted to have the chance to hear from her. I have said for years that sports analytics is the cutting edge of people analytics, that we should pay attention to sports. We can learn from sports. Often what happens in sports today is happening in non-sports organizations in a few years. And Dafna, usually we have to do one or the other. Dafna does both. And so we get a chance to hear from someone who has been actively involved, is actively involved on both sides of that. And one of the questions we have is, what can we be learning in non-sports organizations from sports? So let's start with your own experience, Dafna. Dafna is an athlete, was a competitive athlete here. When you think about how you think about high performance, how did your experience as an athlete inform your model of high performance and how you work with others?
It's a good question. For me, I was always curious about the why. Why can someone who played multi-sports, which was me, and not specialized, sort of froth to the top, whereas those who maybe specialized and trained all over the place, ended up fizzling out. So for me, it was what do I put my discipline and my structure, and how do I view things that allow me to sort of have a mental toughness? And that why, right, sort of was like, okay, I'm curious to know how can we understand it better? And that's, so after starting in the field of information systems and starting, basically it was HR analytics, people analytics for investment banking. I went back and I wanted to study the why for sports psychology and went back to school for that.
So you think in terms of a value hierarchy in your athletes and in your organizations. The values are the why. So can you give us some sense of what possible whys are there when you work with athletes or when you work with executives? What different kind of whys do you run across?
Yeah, so the value hierarchy, right, is what pretty much makes up our constructs that help us explain and understand and give meaning to the world around us. So we can think about it from the sense of, I value, having structure, or I value feeling free, and it's more about a core belief system that has some hierarchy to it. And your lower order values, right, are your convictions and your thoughts at the time that you can sort of prune and give way to. And through reinforcement, right, you think about it almost like an AI model where your hidden layers are your values. And through back propagation, you sort of reevaluate, you reinforce, you take in your experiences, and you understand like what actually needs to get more weight, needs to be more valuable, you need to be more accountable and responsible for, and others that you can sort of let go and merge along with other people's values. So that word value is some sort of, ordinal way of where are you putting your attention, where are you putting your, how are you gauging your actions and responses to the world? So it can be something as basic as, I value honesty, right? And sometimes it's something that's a little bit more meta because it's a relationship across different values and different principles.
Okay. So you use this framework when working with organizations. You've used this framework when working with professional sports teams in any number of sports. One of the things that you do is help them make decisions about what kind of talent to acquire, who to draft, who to sign, who to re-sign. Can you give us an example of using this model of high performance in making that kind of decision?
Sure. So one of the platforms, I have a proprietary machine learning platform, and it uses NLP to take people's written and spoken words to output their big 5 personality traits. But it's really the merging of that with the social psychology piece, so the context in which those personality traits have emerged from, that allow us to understand what is this true of, not is it true. So oftentimes scouts, and I work with scouts so that they actually can ask better questions to understand what is it true of. Not tell me a time when you overcame adversity, because that's gamed, understood, and sometimes like even aspirational. Not an assessment where there's loss of context, loss of meaning, different education, cultural, age, gender impact that creates ambiguity in how someone's reading the question, but also answering, and then how it's being assessed, how it's being understood. So using something like AI, you're able to sort of strip away the biases and make it blind. So you can say, okay, so now I understand this piece. So for example, a team I was working with had a very high draft pick. They were deciding between two players. This
Can
wasn't.
you tell us what sport it is? Is it
in hockey?
In hockey, okay.
And there's no doubt these players had skill, right? Even if you're in the first round, but if you're in, top 10 draft pick, like you're probably going to be pretty good. So it really comes down to this idea of a value hierarchy. And without making it too ambiguous, it's understanding a little bit of, well, what's the organization's value hierarchy in terms of their pipeline, their leadership? What do they need other than performance from this individual? And will they be able to deliver it in this environment, right? And that's something that's often overlooked when we just deal with interviews, when we deal with assessments. We're not really connecting it to what influences this person's likelihood to thrive, and how do we make sure that we can optimize, understand risk when we put them in this environment. So there were two athletes, both of which currently today are very successful with multi-million-dollar, multi-year deals. And the decision was based on, we know that there's differences in their personalities. What can we expect when we bring them into this group? So it's understanding the individual relative to themselves, relative to the people around them, and their environment. And based on their decision, they wouldn't change it.
So what were they trading off there? Did one of these players have a value hierarchy that's just better as an NHL player, or were they just different? And if it was different, how did the club decide which of the two was the right match for them?
So it's a great question, because at the time you also have to take a look at, who are your leaders on the team? And are they really going to be able to, again, bring a high draft pick in who's going to have way more resources, development time, and just ice time given to them, and are they going to meld with the current state, right? It's also in their own projection of what they want to accomplish as a team, right? Again, you're trying to make a kind environment out of something that's not kind, because it's hard to project out injuries and other sort of, things that you hope won't happen or you hope will happen, you just don't know. So in this particular case, if there's one athlete that doesn't mind the spotlight, enjoys, and is part of their persona, right? Because as athletes, you have a little bit of an alter ego, and that's something that's often, I think, discounted when people do assessments on athletes. But the idea is that persona going to go over well here? Because even if they perform well, you still have 20-some other people to think about.
Okay.
You still have a locker room. You still have player development. Are they going to gel well with the player development team? And so knowing that it might take a little bit longer for player A, but it's going to work out well in terms of smoothing everything else out, that value hierarchy for the organization drove their decision. But it takes understanding that, and again, it's a value sort of generalized across the principles of, what an individual values and how well they're going to be able to adapt and acclimate to a specific environment.
So, hard question. You may or may not be able to answer it, but if they were equally talented, it might be easier to choose the guy who's a better teammate, which is probably too crude a summary of what you just said. But sometimes you take the guy who's less of a good teammate just because he's got such skills. You think it's worthwhile. So were they making that trade-off? And was it just easy for them because he was just as good as the other guy, or were they actually trading off a little bit of hard skill for better teammate qualities?
No, it's an important distinction, because the idea is if you need a player now to make a difference now because you're making a playoff run now, right? You might be willing to trade it off because you need to get results. You need the output right away. But this was, I think, more of an investment decision. Okay. So where do you see this person's potential actually amplifying best, in environment A or B?
Okay.
And so it was really sort of a bigger picture.
Okay.
and that's sort of what drove the decision.
Okay. So you came up through sports. You worked outside of sports. You've come back and deployed these kinds of ideas in sports, but you also do a fair bit of this outside of sports. Recruiting, scouting, there's a whole industry around that in sports, and there's lore about it, and you're working in that space. When you think about taking that to corporate and these ideas, what goes through? What can we learn? What do they do well? And then what do you think the limits are from the analogies that we can draw?
Yeah. So I think there's some foundational things that can be explored in corporate. I mean, again, there's some important distinctions of, size and scale and globalization and the fact that you're not playing a game every day, and there's just different sort of strategic initiatives in play. But when we look at the acquisition phase, an acquisition can be a new hire, it could be a leadership development into a promotion, it could be succession planning. And one of the things there is, again, this integration of a person's value hierarchy and their likelihood to thrive in the environment. And so understanding from an organizational perspective, what are the values? What are the core principles? And oftentimes that comes out in this idea of culture. And a lot of times we find in the executive functions, they're probably not living out those values as well as they're asking everyone else to, which is equally important for employees to at least have clearly identified and then make their own choice in being able to say, this is the right environment for me or not. So in that acquisition phase, I think if we look at it more from a scouting perspective, right? So there are some differences for sure. Like in sports, if you're playing hockey, you have metrics that follow you throughout your trajectory into drafting, right? You don't necessarily have that as much in corporate. I mean, we try to sort of, have analogies with resumes and referrals and references and whatnot.
We don't have the back of a baseball card. They have backs of baseball cards.
Right, or you have a profile, or you have a portfolio or something.
Yeah.
The difference is in sports, you're meeting with a psychologist. So it's somebody who's trying to get what the story's true of, mostly. And in many cases now, especially at the combines. We don't do that in corporate, right? We do a lot of outsourcing. We source where we're going to get the people from. We source it to technology to filter through and look for keywords. We source it through and get to a place where someone who probably doesn't recognize some of the social psychology pieces well enough to say, what is the story true of? And so if we could sort of front load that piece of the acquisition phase, then it can inform the rest of the life cycle, including learning and development, engagement surveys, performance reviews, and that can all tie through because we evolve, right? So what your value is when you first start a job might be, I need to pay off my student loans, I need to make a killing, whatever it is, and it might be more externally driven. And this is just an example, it could be the opposite. And then as you evolve through your career and you understand and you're more curious and you want to try new things, now it's like, well, I want to broaden my range, I want to learn new things. So your value goes away from one resource to another. And so we need to be able to carry that thread throughout and not just understand it when someone comes in, but how does that move with them in the organization?
But it is challenging to know it when they come in, right? And that's the example you gave from the sports side was that initial, which player do I draft? Do you want organizations, non-sports organizations, to have folks who act more like scouts, who like live and breathe and came up through it and understand the value system of the organization, who spend time in the field talking to people around the potential athletes that they hire? Is that how you're thinking about it?
I don't know that it's realistic for all organizations, but what I would say is rethinking who are the first set of interviews, and how are we actually getting people in front of them. So, we've heard already up here that AI is going to be a tool that leverages that. I've started with that on the NLP side, and we can continue, and that's just going to, I think, exponentially increase the utility of how we sort of make the first understanding a blind one versus a biased one. And then it's putting really the important people up first. So we sort of, in corporate, you find that you go through these interview stages and you get to decision maker and the most important one later, hoping that they're filtered through all these other, people's, judgments to say you're worthy enough of getting to this level. And I would say, if you put the person who knows the most about what the true environment is like up front, you're going to get to that understanding a lot faster.
What about on the other side of the table? How well do you think job candidates understand their value hierarchy?
That's a great question. I think the expectation is you're not going to understand, nor should you be expected to, but you should be given an opportunity to share what matters to you. I love the word curiosity. What makes you curious? So again, going to what is it true of when you ask someone a question? And it doesn't, we have enough tools to understand if they can actually execute on the task. But really being able to give them a way to describe what energizes them versus what takes away energy. I think that's an important, and that's crafting the questions well and leaving it open enough to where they're not thinking about, am I saying the right thing? But you're understanding how they're thinking. You're understanding thought process. You're understanding even ways in which they would engage in problem solving. So there are, when I was interviewing for jobs, you were given a problem statement and you had to talk aloud. And of course, we all shared, like, how many slices of pizza does the average American consume in a week? Like, that was one of the questions, right?
Right.
So it's not like, are you going to get the answer right, but how are you actually taking steps to think through it?
I know you're not always working with an individual. Sometimes you have executive teams. How do you think about this as a team responsibility as opposed to an individual responsibility? And how should we as leaders and organizations try to spread this out versus take it on as my personal mission?
So I think the interesting thing when it comes to that, that executive level is really saying what you mean and then walking the walk. And I think there's a safety in feeling like you're part of this group, and to recognize that you want to do something differently or to sort of try to implement some sort of change can be really challenging. And to me, that sort of, you don't have to go to the other end of the continuum. It's just recognizing, what can we realistically own? Like, what can we say? We want to say this about ourselves, but what are we really like? And then where are our opportunities to take one small step? So if you look at the value hierarchy, where's the one area for improvement?
We're going to run out of time. I want to give you a last word, but on this one point, bottom line, do you think it's harder for us to assess candidates' value hierarchies or for us to assess our own organizations? Because you really worry about the match. So we have to have clarity on both. Is it as hard for us to be honest? You're just talking about we don't walk the walk, or it's hard to change if we want to change it. So is the challenge as much internal as it is external, or is one of these distinctly more challenging?
I think it somewhat depends on the amount of time you've been inside an organization. So, there's a comfort level, there's a familiarity, there's a sense of what sense of agency do I really have? And so the opportunity really is to say, like, do I believe in myself? Do I believe in the strategies that this environment offers me, this opportunity in corporate offers me to implement change? And then do I believe that I can actually consider myself as part of the outcome? And my recent experience is one where I hear people wanting to. It's really just the pushback against deliverables and productivity. So if we could almost make that the product, and if you can attach KPIs to the value hierarchy, now you're able to have a metric that you can measure, track, and project how well those value hierarchies are actually part of the productivity. So it's connecting it that way. And I think it's often just isolated as wishful thinking.
Okay, we have hit time. Any final words? Any final words for us, Dafna? Any pep talk you want to give us on pursuing more of this?
No, I actually think it would be really interesting for people to go back and rethink that acquisition phase and think about how they can put more of that storytelling and understanding the values of an individual and the value hierarchy of the organization up front, and how that can inform and influence downstream on the life cycle. I think that would be a great starting point to actually nurture this and give some longevity to even improving it and bringing, like, if there are IO psychologists, like bringing them into that acquisition phase.
Cool. Great. Dafna, thank you for the time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.